Good morning, King Cove. It's good to be with you. My name is Pastor Corey. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the lead pastor here at King Cove. If you're visiting with us, we're glad that you are here. We are currently in a series of indeterminate length. Someone asked me, someone mentioned how much longer we were going to go, and I said, we'll see. In the Sermon on the Mount. And today we're in Matthew 5, beginning in verse 38. Jesus says, You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space where heaven and earth meet. Amen. So I've been thinking recently about the martial arts, as one does. Now, I was reminded, I don't know why it popped into my head, but years ago when I was doing my internship at a small Baptist church outside of Chicago, we had a gentleman who taught in the Winnetka School District, phys ed, and he held black belts in 4 or 5 different martial arts disciplines. And so we had him come to the church to do a self-defense course. And what I remember about him was a couple things. One was he was a very large man. 2, when you shook his hand, it felt like grabbing onto a 2x4. Which made me think, I don't want him striking with an open hand or anything. But also, he talked about 2 of his black belts were in judo and jiu-jitsu, and he talked about the principles of those particular martial arts. And if you're not familiar, judo, the principles for judo are maximum efficiency and minimum effort, and mutual welfare and benefit. And so there's a concept which I am not going to try to pronounce because I do not want to insult any of our Japanese brothers and sisters. But the English translation is something like softness controls hardness. Because one of the primary ideas behind judo is that you use the person who's attacking you, you use their energy and you transform it against them, right? Jiu-jitsu is similar. The words that make up jiu-jitsu can be translated gentle, soft, supple, flexible, pliable, or yielding. So it has a literal translation of jiu-jitsu would be yielding art, and its core philosophy is to manipulate the opponent's force against themselves, rather than confronting it with your own force. So this idea is, the reason I think I've been thinking about it is because of the text that we just read. Now, a little explanation because I see a couple furrowed brows. I know that when we read this text, we perhaps hear or interpret complete passivity. When we read, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you, turn to them the other cheek also. If anybody wants to sue you and take your shirt, give them your coat. If they force you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Right? And I think the way we hear this, or at least the way I heard it for many years, is kind of, not kind of, but complete passivity. And I think this is where some people struggle with the teachings of Jesus. Because we hear this and we think, well, now, Jesus, what about fill in the blank? I mean, we can come up with any number of scenarios, right? About, well, what about if this happens or that happens? And I think partly where we get into trouble with that is the way that we hear this word. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of the original language and the meanings of those words. If you want to do a deep dive on this passage, I would commend to you once again the Bible Project's episode on this passage from last year's series on Sermon on the Mount. It's a whole hour long. We're not going to do an hour this morning. But they do a great job of unpacking the Greek word that means do not resist an evil person. And essentially, their argument, and I think they are correct, is that when you understand that word in its original context and original language, a better way to translate it would be, instead of saying do not resist evil, to say something along the lines of do not stand against evil in the same way, or resist in kind. So, do you hear the subtle difference there? Jesus is not saying, do not resist evil, lie down and be a doormat for people to walk all over you. Jesus is saying, do not resist in kind. And what he then walks through in this passage demonstrates that. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Paul's paraphrase or interpretation of this command or ethic of Jesus, we can see in two different places. 1 Thessalonians 5:15 says, make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. That sounds to me kind of like the idea of mutual welfare and benefit. Right? Do not pay back wrong for wrong, but strive to do what is good for each other and everyone else. Now, having said that, maybe we can read that and go, okay, so not a doormat, but still a pretty high bar. I mean, I think we can all recognize places in our lives where when someone has wronged us, our response unreflexively or unthoughtfully is to respond at very least in kind and not to think about their benefit or welfare. Paul also says in Romans 12, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. And again, we hear the challenge in those words. So what is Jesus saying? What's happening in this text? And I think what we see here is similar to the passages that we've been in. This is the 6th of 6 examples, right, that Jesus is giving in this section of how it is that we interact with one another. Now, a couple of things about this first section, or the first example that Jesus gives. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Now, what immediately came to mind for me when I was starting to dive into this text to prepare for this morning is a certain incident that happened not that long ago on national TV. Maybe some of you will remember it. of Will Smith getting up in the middle of the Oscars and slapping Chris Rock across the face, right? Now, we do not have time to dissect that little beef, right? But it's an example. I mean, that's an example of what we're talking about, this kind of aggression, right? Now, a couple things you need to understand about slapping in this, in the context of Jesus. The first is this, that to slap someone on the right cheek represents a particular kind of slap. We have in common vernacular a name for it, which I cannot say from the pulpit, but it's a backhanded slap. For me to slap someone on the right cheek, I have to backhand them. Right? This is an insult to that person's dignity. This is the kind of slap that you would do to someone who you do not see as an equal or of really any value at all. It was a grievous insult in that culture to slap someone on the right cheek, which makes what Jesus says next even more challenging, right? Do not offer them then the other cheek as well, which seems to us in our Western mindset, in kind of our American, individualism and asserting our rights way, that this seems weak. But here's where it gets interesting. To slap someone who you see as equal to you, you would slap them on the left cheek with an open hand, which coincidentally, if you go back and watch the tape from the Academy Awards, that's what happened there, I believe. So if I have a disagreement with you and I see you as an equal and I do not want to insult you but challenge you, I will slap you with an open hand across your left cheek. So I think that what's happening here is what Jesus is saying is do not resist in kind, but he's also showing that you do not have to lay down and be a doormat. Because what happens if someone backhands me and I stand up and I look them in the face and I offer them my other cheek? What's happening is I am forcing them to look at me and to treat me as an equal, even as they abuse me. Right? So what Jesus is saying is not simply, hey man, just, let them have at you. Jesus is saying, do not resist in kind, do not resort to violence, but make them look you in the eye and see the image of God in you. Remember that all of the examples that we've been talking about these last several weeks, from adultery to divorce, all of those have one thread in common, which is recognizing and honoring the image of God and the dignity of humankind. Jesus, again, in this passage, is making sure that we recognize the dignity in one another. So when someone slaps you, it's not that you don't resist. You don't resist in kind. Now, the next two examples are similar. Jesus says, if someone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Now, again, we don't have a full hour to unpack all of these different things, but there is a command in the Old Testament that if someone owes you money, you cannot take their outer cloak, because that's essentially their blanket at night. And so that's not allowed by the law. You can take their shirt, but you can't take their cloak. And if you do take their cloak, you have to give it back to them in the evening so that they can be warm at night or covered at night. So this is Tim Mackey, who's the Bible scholar for the Bible Project, makes an interesting argument here. His argument is that so if someone sues you to take your shirt, and the assumption here, remember, for all of these examples, this is important context, is a subjugated people. This is a people who are being occupied by an outside force. And also, there's apparently some stuff going on culturally around taking laws that were meant for wider social implication and making them apply to personal grievances. Mackey argues that what Jesus is in essence saying here is that if someone sues you and takes your shirt, you take off your coat and you say, "Here, take this as well." Well, guess what you are at this point? Naked. So that is not passive. It's also, we could spend a lot of time there, right? But what, again, the argument is that what Jesus is doing is by doing so and looking that person directly in the eye and offering this is forcing them to see you and the injury that they are doing to you. It's really quite subversive. And quite honestly, a little shocking. Especially for our, we have our issues around the human body and all of that, right? But what Jesus is after here is to make that person who is unjustly taking your shirt to see you and to see the image of God in you. Similarly, if anyone forces you to go a mile, go with them 2 miles. If you've been around church for any length of time, you've probably heard this talked about, but the idea here is, as a subjugated people, a Roman soldier could walk up to you, hand you their pack, and say, you carry this for me. You had no right to resist. Imagine the humiliation, right? Of a soldier coming up to you and forcing you into service. And so what Jesus is saying is, well, if they force you into service, then you go an extra mile. And I don't think he means you go pouting, angry, surly, whatever. I think he means you turn it around on them and you engage them as an equal. You make them see you in the image of God in you. So what I think we're seeing in these examples is, especially that last one, what one commentator called subversive hospitality. Right? You love them and you serve them even while making them engage with your humanity, with the image of God in you. Now, I recognize that this maybe seems like a tall order, and it maybe seems, no less realistic than, what we've heard from some of our politicians who suggest that these words of Jesus are not to be taken seriously or at all. But we have examples from history of how this plays out, right? Gandhi, who wasn't even a Christian, was captivated by Jesus' teachings and took his nonviolent resistance directly from this passage. And what happened in India? Ultimately, because of this approach, India was freed from subjugation by the British Empire. Now, was it costly? Yes. Did people die before it finally took root? Yes. But the Indian people stood and looked those British soldiers and leaders and rulers in the eye and made them see the image of God in them, their humanity. In our own nation, Dr. Martin Luther King, who we celebrated last weekend, used this passage and this approach in the civil rights campaign. And if you study the civil rights campaign, you will learn that there was a particular day when the nation was galvanized and the tide started to turn. It was the March to Selma. And what happened that was different on that day? Well, what happened that was different on that day was that not so much in the way that the marchers were treated, but in the fact that it was televised. And the nation was forced to look itself in the eye and see the way that we were dehumanizing our brothers and sisters. And that was the tipping point in the civil rights movement. Because Dr. King understood that if someone strikes you on the right cheek, you offer them your left, but you make them look you in the eye while you do it. If someone takes your shirt, then you give them your coat. If someone forces you to carry their pack for a mile, then you carry it too. Following the command of Jesus, nonviolent resistance, not resisting in kind, forced power to reframe. And that's where the tipping point came. The reality is that this is a super challenging teaching. But I will say, as I have said from the beginning of this series, I do not think that Jesus gave and taught the principles that he's teaching as simply some kind of, pie in the sky approach. Jesus was serious, and he was inviting us into the very path that he followed to the cross. A path of radically subversive love. The underlying principle in this whole section and the 5 examples that preceded this that we've looked at in the last several weeks is Jesus explicating the heart of the law. Remember that Jesus, when he says, "You have heard it said," this is all in response to about 10, 15 verses ago, when he says that not one jot or tittle will disappear from the law, that he came to fulfill the law. This is Jesus fulfilling the law. It's not just a matter of not retaliating in kind. It's taking it to a whole different level. Because the heart of the law and his fulfillment of it highlights the image of God in humankind that comes from being image bearers. And that the object of the law is for humans to be fully human and to follow in the way of Jesus and to be a part of his kingdom. Jesus wants us to take him seriously. Now, is that easy? No, it is not. Does it take further conversation and, really seeking to understand God's will in particular situations? Yes, it does. But the question for us, I think, which is especially appropriate in our current context, in the current realities that we see around us, is in the face of violence, in the face of injustice, how can we respond in a way that reflects the shalom of God and in a way that exposes injustice and can affect real change. Because that's what ultimately Jesus' way of life does, is it expands the shalom in the presence of the kingdom, and it exposes injustice, and it can and does effect real change, both in us and in the world around us. So what do we do in an age when there is all kinds of confusion and disagreement and just chaos? I was at the midwinter conference of the Covenant Church last week, which is the pastors meet for continuing education every year. And while one of the conversations I had there, I was reminded of a part of our history. Now, this gets a little theology geeky. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the Covenant Church comes out of the Pietist movement. We don't have time to unpack the Pietist movement, but the Pietist movement came out of a revival in Germany that was led and began on the estate of a count named, and you can't make this stuff up, Zinzendorf. And one of the things that Zinzendorf did is he started something called the Order of the Mustard Seed. It had 3 principles. Those principles are these. 1, be kind to all people. 2, seek their welfare. 3, win them to Christ. I don't know, friends, of a more radical, revolutionary, Jesus way kind of act in our current contexts than being kind. We live in an era that is filled with anger, rage, violence, not seeing the image of God in one another. And so imagine how radical an act just being kind is in that context. Another phrase that comes out of that era is on our wall under our mission or above our mission TV screen. The goal of everything we do as pietists and followers of Jesus is to seek God's glory and neighbor's good. When we do that, we will be living in the way of Jesus. We will not be responding in kind. And we will be taking on radical acts of hospitality and kindness. In closing, I want to read for you again this passage, this time from the Message translation. Jesus says, here's another old saying that deserves a second look. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Is that going to get us anywhere? Here's what I propose. Don't hit back at all. If someone strikes you, stand there and take it. If someone drags you into court and sues you for the shirt off your back, gift wrap your best coat and make a present of it. And if someone takes unfair advantage of you, use the occasion to practice the servant life. No more tit-for-tat stuff. Live generously. Amen.